The Quietest Day, October 9th, 1997, Fairfield, Maine. I hadn't been back to Fairfield, Maine, in nearly 10 years. The place seemed trapped in time, small and forgotten, the way only quiet New England towns could be. The only thing different was me. Older, skeptical, weighted down with memories that I wasn't sure I wanted to stir up. But here I was, standing in front of the house I'd grown up in, a place that would be gone in 2 weeks. It was slated for demolition, and I'd told myself I needed to see it one last time. Closure, I whispered to myself, but it felt thin, like an excuse. This was more about something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The house loomed ahead, peeling paint and sagging roof, the kind of decay that seemed almost eager to consume itself. I made my way up the creaking porch steps, gripping the railing as if that old wood might still remember me. Inside, the air was heavy, not stale exactly, but thick in a way that pressed against my skin. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place, a strange, metallic edge in the air. Every room felt like a photograph left out in the sun. Faded, brittle, familiar yet hollow. I took my time, touching the walls as if they held some secret I'd forgotten. The kitchen felt the same, down to the scratched counter where my mother had rolled out dough and the cupboard that never quite closed. I lingered there, half expecting to see her, moving quietly by the stove, humming to herself. But all I found was silence, thick and unbroken, as if the house had sealed itself against my presence. In the hall, a different memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered being a child, standing right here, looking at my own reflection in the dusty mirror that still hung crooked on the wall. But this memory didn't bring comfort. My pulse quickened as I took a slow step closer, staring at the tarnished glass. My reflection felt off, a faint familiarity but also a distance, like looking at a stranger who happened to wear my face. Then from somewhere deep in the house there was a creak, not the slow groan of old wood, but a distinct, deliberate sound, like footsteps. I froze, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge. But nothing came. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments. Inside, the silence was unnaturally dense, the kind of quiet that absorbs sound, swallowing every creak of the floor, every shift of fabric. It was unsettling. Even for an empty house, it was too quiet. I found myself listening, as if trying to hear beneath that silence, waiting for a break, a breath, something. But it held steady, unyielding. I began moving through the rooms slowly, as though exploring someone else's memories. Each room was steeped in its own peculiar weight. The living room was filled with yellowed light that streamed in through the cracked windows, illuminating dust motes suspended like tiny planets in orbit. A chair was still angled toward the television, which was blank and dark, facing the room like a single, unblinking eye. I moved on quickly. In the kitchen, everything looked as I remembered it, almost eerily so. I ran my hand over the countertop, feeling its familiar grooves. My mother used to sing while she cooked, her voice soft, lilting, filling the space effortlessly. But now, the quiet felt layered, pressing into every corner. The silence here was different, too. Not the empty kind, but almost intentional, like it had been waiting for me. I thought I caught a faint metallic tang in the air again, sharp and sour, like something just turned. Then I found myself standing at the base of the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. I hesitated. I could feel a strange pull toward my old room, but a wariness crept up alongside it. It was the one place I had truly made my own as a child, a sanctuary of sorts. I took a step, and the old staircase let out a long, low groan beneath my weight, the sound echoing down the hall. As I climbed, I noticed the light seemed dimmer, as if each step absorbed a little more of it. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me like a tunnel. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, including mine. But something about that closed door at the end of the hall felt off, different from the others. The handle seemed to stare back at me, waiting. I reached out, hand hovering over the door, a vague unease prickling my skin. I didn't know what I expected, memories, ghosts, something in between. But as my fingers touched the cold metal handle, I knew this house had secrets. And somehow, I felt certain it had been keeping them just for me. Inside my old room, everything felt small, like the walls had crept inward over the years, closing in on the space I once claimed as my own. The ceiling seemed lower, the shadows thicker, and the corners darker than I remembered. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, feeling a chill settle over me that didn't come from the autumn air. The room was bare. No posters, no bedding, no reminders of the life I'd once lived here. Only the dresser stood against the wall, its paint chipped and drawer handles tarnished, an untouched relic from my childhood. I walked over, kneeling to open the top drawer, half expecting to find some remnant of myself left behind. It was empty. One by one, I pulled each drawer open, empty, 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 and then I reached the small bottom drawer, almost hidden by the shadow of the dresser. It resisted at first, stuck with age, but I yanked it harder, and it finally slid open with a small sigh, like a breath held too long. Inside lay a single slip of paper, yellowed with time, edges brittle and worn. The sight of it made my skin prickle. I picked it up, squinting to make out the faded handwriting. My mother's, unmistakable in its careful loops and curves. Written on the paper was a name and an address. Carmen Jensen, 1928-1975, Oakwood Cemetery, Lot 14. I froze, staring at the words. I knew every name in our family, every friend and acquaintance my parents had ever mentioned, but I had no memory of a Carmen Jensen. I turned the slip over, half expecting more writing, an explanation, but the back was blank. Who was she? Why had my mother written this down and left it here, alone in the bottom drawer? A faint rustling noise caught my attention, and I looked up sharply. The air felt colder, like the room itself had drawn in a breath. The silence wrapped itself around me, closer, denser, as if the walls were listening. Slowly I tucked the slip of paper into my pocket, feeling its weight like an anchor. I stood up, glancing around one last time, and left the room, the unanswered question pressing against my thoughts. Why did my mother keep this name? As I moved through the upstairs hallway, my eyes fell on the attic door at the end of the corridor. I hadn't thought about the attic in years. Growing up, we'd stored old holiday decorations and boxes of dusty photo albums up there, but it was a place none of us ever visited, a forgotten corner of the house. Still, something pulled me toward it, an almost magnetic urge. The door had a warped, swollen look, as if it had grown around its frame, holding itself shut. I reached for the handle, expecting the same smooth, hollow click that every other door in this house had. But it resisted, locked tight. I let out a small sigh, more annoyed than disappointed, and was about to turn away when I noticed a small glint at the edge of the carpet by the door. I bent down, fingers grazing a tiny metal object wedged just under the frame. A key, old, tarnished, with a faded flower engraved into its bow. My fingers closed around it, and for a second a cold prickle washed over my skin. I shook off the feeling and slid the key into the attic door's lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a soft click, that echoed down the empty hallway. I pushed the door open, releasing a wave of cool, stale air. The attic smelled different from the rest of the house. Sharp, almost sweet, with a faint undercurrent of wildflowers that made my skin tingle. I flicked on the single light bulb dangling from the ceiling, and the dim light barely reached the edges of the room, casting an eerie glow over the dust and forgotten relics. In the center of the attic, among the abandoned boxes and cracked trunks, sat an old wooden chest that I'd never seen before. Its surface was smooth, polished, oddly pristine in contrast to the rest of the room. Something about it seemed out of place, like it had been left there recently, waiting for me. I knelt beside the chest, running my fingers over the smooth wood. It had a small lock on it, delicate and intricate, yet oddly familiar. I pulled the key from the attic door and tried it in the lock. It fit perfectly. Inside, nestled beneath a piece of folded cloth, was a small stack of letters. I picked up the first one, my heart pounding as I recognized my mother's handwriting. A strange fear crept up my spine as I opened the letter, feeling as though I was about to read something I could never unlearn. The morning after my unsettling discovery in the attic, I felt an irresistible pull toward Oakwood Cemetery. I'd barely slept, my mind turning over the letter I'd read, my mother's words both intimate and cryptic. They were addressed to someone named Carmen, yet her tone was oddly reserved, almost formal. She mentioned promises kept and regrets, but offered nothing that made sense without context. I needed answers, and somehow I felt certain that Oakwood held a piece of the puzzle. The cemetery was quiet, almost abandoned. October had painted the trees in fiery reds and oranges, casting long shadows across the headstones. I walked along the gravel path, my footsteps muffled by fallen leaves, looking for Lot 14. The farther I walked, the more I felt a strange calm settle over me. The air here was different, thick with a peaceful heaviness that seemed to press against my skin. Finally, I found it. Carmen Jensen, 1928 to 1975. Her headstone was small and plain, unremarkable among the others. I felt a strange, inexplicable connection to the name, a pull that defied logic. Just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. There, half buried under the damp leaves beside the headstone, was a small, rusted key. I knelt down, brushing away the leaves to reveal the key fully. It was old, its metal dull and corroded, yet familiar. The same delicate flower engraving marked the bow, identical to the one I'd used for the attic door and the chest. My pulse quickened as I held it in my hand, feeling its unexpected weight. How had it ended up here, by the grave of a woman my mother seemed to know, yet never spoke of? As I rose, a slight breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a faint hint of wildflowers. The scent was sharper now, almost suffocating. I stood there unmoving, gripping the key tightly, feeling as though I'd trespassed into something private, something sacred. The cemetery's stillness pressed down on me, and for a moment I wondered if I should simply walk away, leave the key there and forget whatever I thought I was looking for. But I couldn't. The key felt like an invitation, a summons to uncover whatever secret had been buried, along with Carmen Jensen. I tucked it into my pocket, aware that this discovery had bound me tighter to the mystery. I left the cemetery, feeling a creeping sense of inevitability, as if whatever lay ahead had already been set in motion, long before I'd ever returned to Fairfield. That evening, back at the house, I sat on the floor of my old room, the small stack of letters from the attic spread out before me. The new key I'd found at the cemetery lay beside them, a cold, silent presence that felt more like an accusation than a discovery. I hadn't yet opened another letter since reading the first, hesitant to unearth whatever fragments of truth my mother had hidden. But I knew I couldn't stop now. Each letter was part of a story, one she hadn't wanted me to know, or perhaps one she couldn't bear to tell. I picked up the next letter, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. The paper was soft and delicate, worn thin by time, yet the ink was sharp and clear, each word etched with intention. The opening line struck me like a blow. I don't know if I made the right choice, but it's too late to change it now. My mother's handwriting, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like the writing of a stranger. As I read, the tone became even more unsettling. My mother wrote of Carmen with a mix of guilt and reverence, referring to her as a friend, yet hinting at a bond that ran deeper, darker. She mentioned secrets they'd kept together, something they'd shared that was now buried in Oakwood Cemetery. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. What could Carmen Jensen have meant to my mother? And what did she mean by shared? Then near the end of the letter I found something that made my breath catch. "The child will never know," you said. We agreed on that, but promises made in silence are fragile things, and sometimes they unravel without warning. The child. The words echoed in my mind, sharp and disorienting, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit but wouldn't let go. A cold realization began to settle over me. My mother was speaking of me, of some unspoken promise she had made with this woman, now lying in lot 14. I felt a sudden, intense need to put the letter down, to distance myself from the words that seemed to warp everything I thought I knew. But the more I read, the more I felt that these letters were intended for me. A final confession from a woman who had left this world with secrets buried deep. They were clues, fragments of a truth that had waited years to be uncovered. And I knew that this truth, whatever it was, had already begun to change me. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, the letter's words spinning through my mind, pressing in on me with a weight I couldn't shake. "The child will never know," my mother had written, but she'd been wrong. I was beginning to know, even if I didn't yet understand. A strange dread wrapped itself around me, like the memory of a nightmare I couldn't quite recall. The thought of Carmen Jensen, buried in lot 14, lingered, her name carving itself into my thoughts like something essential I'd always known, but somehow forgotten. Eventually, sleep took me, but it was a restless, broken kind. And in the fragile moments between waking and dreaming, flashes of scenes began to play behind my closed eyes. Places and faces that felt familiar and foreign all at once. A narrow house, painted a shade of blue I had never seen, yet somehow new. A woman's face, kind but solemn, as she held my hand in a small, dimly lit room, and the smell of wildflowers, thick and intoxicating, filling the air as she whispered something to me I couldn't hear. I woke abruptly, heart racing, disoriented. The room around me was too quiet, the dark pressing against the edges of my vision. I reached instinctively for my wrist, fingers tracing the birthmark there, a small, crescent-shaped mark I'd always had. I'd never thought much of it before, just a quirk of my skin, a tiny detail that made me. But now, in the silence, it felt like something more. A sign, a marker of something deeper, something I had yet to understand. A strange, unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if the memories I'd always held as my own weren't entirely mine? What if there was another layer, a past, buried beneath my own, one that belonged to someone else? The idea was absurd, but the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it tightened its grip on me. I left my room and wandered the house, the familiar halls and rooms now filled with the weight of a stranger's presence. Every corner, every shadow seemed to breathe with stories I didn't recognize, like echoes of another life. And I realized then, with a chill running down my spine, that these fragments, the house, the letters, the scent of wildflowers, had been waiting, buried beneath the surface of my memories, waiting for this moment to be remembered. By morning, my decision was made. I needed to return to Oakwood Cemetery, to Carmen Jensen's grave. I didn't know what I was looking for or even what I expected to find, but the pull was undeniable, as if the answer had been waiting there all along, hidden beneath the weight of years and soil. The sky was overcast when I arrived, casting a soft, dim light across the grounds. Oakwood was empty, and a strange calm settled over me as I walked through the rows of headstones, each one a marker for a life and a story. When I reached Lot 14, I hesitated. Carmen's headstone stood in quiet dignity, unremarkable among the others. But now, knowing what I did, or perhaps sensing what I was only beginning to understand, it felt as if she were waiting for me. I knelt by the grave, brushing the damp leaves away from the engraved letters. The slip of paper with her name and burial site tucked into the bottom drawer in my room felt like an offering now, a fragile thread connecting us across time. I took a deep breath, half expecting to feel some revelation in the air, a whisper, a sign, something. But there was only silence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key I'd found near her grave days before. I held it tightly, feeling its cold, rough metal against my skin. In that moment, a memory surged forward, unbidden and strange. A fleeting image of myself, barely a child, sitting beside a woman in a quiet room. Her face was blurred, but her presence was comforting, familiar in a way that made my heart ache. She had held a key, much like this one, and pressed it into my small hand, whispering, "One day you'll understand." As the memory faded, a profound sadness swept over me, a grief for something I couldn't name. It was then I realized the truth, a truth that had been woven through the letters, hidden in my mother's words. Carmen Jensen wasn't just a stranger from my mother's past. She was my mother, my first mother, and my entire life, my birthmark, my memories, had been pieces of her, buried beneath my own. I knelt there, the weight of the truth settling over me like a shroud. The scent of wildflowers rose again, soft and insistent, wrapping around me. It was Carmen's last embrace, a farewell from someone I'd never known, but had always been a part of me. And in the quiet of Oakwood Cemetery, I finally felt whole. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments.